everybody, Buzz here for Buzzing Around the World, and we have just arrived to climb the Chichonal Volcano. So I was in a large tour group with about 20 to 25 people, and here we are starting our walk. The walk to the crater of the volcano is 5.5 kilometers in each direction. Quick summary, it's about 5.5 kilometers to the initial ridge. When you get to that ridge, it's about another 400 yards to the view of the volcano. It's about another 200 yards to climb down into the crater of the volcano, and then of course you have to climb back up. I'm going to go ahead and speed it up here. Instead of recording the entire 6-hour hike, I decided to record about every 15 minutes, a 5 to 10 second increment, which I've speeded up in double time. So you can see that the walk starts pretty flat, but don't let that fool you. This was definitely the hardest hike I have ever done. There were a couple times where I wasn't sure I was going to make it. We did stop to take multiple breaks, and one hiker brought their dog with, who was probably the best hiker out of the entire group. So the initial 2.5 kilometers is very flat, and there's maybe just a couple up and down areas. But you can see that ridge now. We're actually going to go up over that ridge, which is just exhausting. I went with the tour group La Jungla, which was an excellent tour group. My guide Ramon had toured the Palenque ruins with me the day before, and he had me well prepared to go on this hike, but I was not well prepared myself. Ramon was very knowledgeable, but I was the only native English speaker on the tour, so most of his instructions were given in Spanish. Thankfully, I speak a little bit of Spanish, and I was able to understand most of the information. Kind of about 2 kilometers in or so, we walked through the river basin, and eventually climbed out of the river basin, and then it became a lot more jungle-like. There was one area we went through that was covered and dark. It was basically like a tunnel that was covered in trees. At this point, I became pretty confident because I figured we were almost halfway to the summit. You can see, though, that the ridge that we're going to climb over still is quite a ways off in the distance, and this is where the hike began to go up. And at this point, I went from being one of the first ones in line to being passed by multiple hikers. You'll also notice at this point, I took multiple breaks to turn and pan and look at what was behind us. That was where we came from. So, one big problem I had was I brought with 3 liters of water. And before we even got close to the top of the ridge, I was already through 2 liters of water. So, one thing I highly suggest if you take this hike is bring at least 5 liters of water. By the time I was done, I drank my 3 liters of water and probably another 3 liters of water from a few of the guides, and then probably another liter of water from a fellow hiker. We took multiple breaks as a group. It was about 95 degrees with a 70 dew point, and there's not a lot of shade. It was also very sunny, so breaks were definitely needed. At this point, I fell really far behind. You can see that I'm getting kind of close to the ridge, and I'm still stopping to pan every 100 yards or so because it's so exhausting to climb up. But at this point, I was starting to think that I might actually be able to make it to the summit, despite the fact that it was a steady incline, probably a change in altitude of around 2,000 feet. So, I'm pretty much by myself here. Everybody else had passed me. Despite doing many hikes, most of my hikes are flat. I'm not great at changing elevation. At this point, the ridge was only about 1 kilometer away. I figured if I didn't make it, I could spend the night at this campsite. When I got over the ridge, I realized it was actually a false ridge. There was probably another 300 or 400 yards to go. So I did not film much of that because I was struggling to even stay on my feet, and taking out my GoPro was the last thing on my mind. So this is the last 25 to 30 yards coming up towards the summit. I was pleased to know that after about 2 hours of climbing, I was only about 10 minutes behind. So at the top, we were treated to spectacular views of the crater of the Chichonal Volcano. The water smelled very much like sulfur, and it's very green colored. After spending about 15 to 20 minutes sitting and resting and posing for some pictures, I was just so happy to have made it the 5.5 kilometers to the top. At this point, I was out of my water, and the guide gave me some of his water. But what I did next was probably not a good decision. So in a moment, you'll see that we're going to hike a little further along the rim of the crater, and eventually we're going to reach a point where you can climb down. Now, I told the guide, Ramon, that I was going to stay at the top, which about half of our group did. But one of the other guys, Rogelio, told me that he thought I could do it and that I should definitely climb down because I'll regret it if I didn't. So I took Rogelio's advice and I climbed down into the crater. During the climb, I had to put my GoPro and my camera in my backpack. You can see there that the puppy was ready to go down into the crater, but its owner wouldn't let it because they thought it would be a little bit too dangerous for the dog to climb. So here's Ramon. He's explaining how to go down. You want to keep at least 3 of your limbs on the rocks at all times. So 2 legs and an arm, or 2 arms and a leg. I let most of the group go first because I figured if I did fall, at least I wouldn't be taking anyone out. It wasn't real dangerous going down. If you did fall, and I fell one time, the worst that would happen is that you fall about 4 to 6 feet. So here I made it down to the bottom, and Ramon was very pleased to see me, and I was rewarded with some spectacular views of the lake at the bottom of the crater. After being down here for about 5 minutes, I decided to head back up because I knew it was going to take me a long time to return to the ridge. It ended up taking probably 90 plus minutes for me to get to the top. And at one point, I literally didn't think I was going to make it. I thought they were going to have to call the helicopter. I got to the point where I would go 5 to 6 feet at a time and then literally take a break for 10 minutes before I went up again. Now, I eventually made it to the top, and once I got on the kind of flat or downhill ground, it was not nearly as bad as it was coming up, and I was able to just kind of lean forward and track downhill. At this point, I was fairly far behind everybody except for 2 climbers that had struggled, not so much climbing up the ridge, but they were having a hard time. They were just exhausted walking back on the downhill and flat ground. So when I got back to the river, I took a wrong turn and didn't find the path, and I ended up walking about 400 yards extra downstream, and Rogelio had to follow my footsteps and track me down. I did eventually make it back, and I was treated with a standing ovation from my fellow climbing mates. It was a humbling experience. If it wasn't for Rogelio, I'm not sure if I would have made it back. And I've never been it before, but I was definitely, quote, that guy, end quote, on this tour today. It was still an amazing experience, and I'm glad I did it, but it was definitely one of the hardest things I've ever done. This is Buzz from Buzzing Around the World, and I hope you enjoyed my summary of my climb of the Chichonal Volcano.